Here we're going to be talking about the story, The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin. So again, here's a story where one of the major things that should be highlighted is that there's an implicit perspective of a storyteller, right? So instead of having the perspective of a character in the story say what's going on with them throughout the plot, and instead of having the perspective of an all-knowing narrator telling you what's going on with all the relevant characters or just with describing a city to you, we have someone who's directly engaging with the audience, which is pretty rare in novels and short stories in general, and allows us to kind of engage with how things go along, considering what that implicit perspective is, right? So when someone is directly telling you a story, they have potentially a whole personality, right? Priorities, desires, intentions, a purpose in telling you this story. So it's particularly helpful when we consider like what a dystopia is doing, why someone would tell you something potentially with a moral to the story, right? So if I were to tell like Little Red Riding Hood, and if somebody in whatever, like 1700s Germany was telling you Little Red Riding Hood, we might be aiming at a different purpose, right? If you're telling a child this story, if that's the audience that you're focusing on, that would be different than if you're telling a college English class, right? You might focus on different things. With the college English class, you might be focusing on descriptions of characterization and themes, right? Really making sure that you're focused throughout. If you're telling a child, I don't really know, are you trying to scare them? So you're focusing on long teeth? Hard to say. Okay, obviously I don't have children, obviously because of what I just said. So, okay, so keeping that in mind, here's what our storyteller conveys, right? Here's some highlights to maybe consider and then critically engage, because we want to keep in mind, what is the storyteller trying to evoke in the audience by telling us these things, right? So I just want to emphasize that this should be, maybe I'm encouraging this to be the way that we engage with this story. Okay, so first off, in the first 2 pages, we get a very positive picture of Omelas, right? We enter with a ceremony. We've got a trumpet player who seems kind of, they're characterized with kind of perfection, right? And we get the idea that Omelas is kind of a perfect city, right? One thing to kind of note though, we don't get a super lot of detail. One thing that we could have done what would be to just try from memory to describe the first 2 pages, from the first 2 pages, in as much detail as you can, what Omelas is like. This is an activity that if we were spending more time on this text, we would try. Because we're just using it for other purposes, we won't, but consider how little detail there is in the first 2 pages. We fill it in because we're reading and we're imaginative creatures, but you get 5 different people describing what Omelas is based on those first 2 pages, you get very different descriptions, okay? The one thing that everyone has to do is say, it's happy. Happiness and pleasure are there, right? So consider how that makes you interpret this story, right? Some things are very explicit and some things are left open to interpretation. And also I mentioned this activity because that's something you might want to consider too, that different people have different interpretations. Do you think that's something intentional by the storyteller? Do you think that people have interpretations is insightful about human perspective? I think there's a lot of different ways you can go, but I think it's important to note the results of that exercise. Okay, so in those first 2 pages, it's ebullient with descriptions of perfection and especially happiness. Okay, so then we get this revelation of the child. This could not contrast more with glorious happiness, right? basically the emphasis here is on squalor and pain. And if you start thinking about any reprieve or qualification, like exception to that pain and misery, she encourages us, the storyteller encourages us to say, no, there is not really any exception to the miserable life this child is leading. So the next important point we get is that in order to live in Omelas, you must be aware of this child. Okay? So this is an interesting thing to focus on, right? Why is she telling the story of Omelas in this way? There's an order to the story that she decided to tell. There's emphases that she's giving, and there's inclusions that she's giving, right? So why is she telling it? Think about the different aspects of storytelling, right? Rising plot, structure, right? She could have included the child first and then compared, right? So think about what she's trying to evoke from her audience in telling things the way she does. Okay, so what comes next after explaining the child and then emphasizing you can't live in Omelas without being aware of it? Well, she describes the number of different reactions people have to this child. This is another thing to consider, right? Was this something that needed to be included? The authors made it a choice to impact the audience in this way. At the beginning, we get this emphasis on everybody being happy, right? Part of their perfect happy world, or what the storyteller conveys as a perfect happy world, includes their reactions, the variety of reactions to knowing about this child. People are allowed to view the child as many times as they want after they're aware of it, aware of them. And that's something to consider. What emphases, what implicit judgments, if any, is the storyteller giving us to these variety of reactions, right? Okay. So consider the different responses, and now consider the impact that the author means for us to have. So what are you supposed to feel about these different responses? And remember this aspect of storytelling. Is there an intentional way the author's trying to make you respond? Is the author trying to be a neutral storyteller, right? Try to remember how intentional the structure is. Is that, and the explicit ways that the author is describing things, is there an attempt at objectivity here, right? That's another possibility. I don't mean to discount that. Some people read this as an attempt at objectivity. But even if it is that attempt, you need to do that intentionally, thinking about how your audience will respond, right? Okay, finally, try to consider how storytellers, I've mentioned this before, need to focus on some things and leave other things out. There are things that are included that could have been left out in order to create a different picture. And the final conclusion of the story is a conclusion that was led to. What are some alternatives that the author could have focused on? What are some alternatives that might be happening in the city that the author doesn't focus on? And what are some alternatives that could exist in the city that might just not, right? So the story is called The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas. What else could it be called? And what alternatives might the city folk just not be doing, right? We get some descriptions of different things happening in the city, the ceremony, the child, the reactions to the child that include abandoning the city and return viewing in a variety of ways, right? How do people in the city respond potentially to the respond viewers, to the ones who walk away, right? We don't know. We don't know if there are different groups who have developed, for instance, where's religion, right? So that's described in the first 2 pages. Does that relate at all to the child? Does it relate at all to the different people who respond to the child? That's missing. Do you think that's important? Do you think it doesn't exist because it wasn't mentioned? Those are the kinds of things I mean. Sorry, I don't mean to be abstract and not suggestive. Okay, So that's where we're going to leave the content video. I'm going to have some questions pointing us to the discussion for the week in the next video. So thanks for listening. This is our content video for the ones who walked away from Omelas. Bye.